Hi guys, in this video I explain how to compare objects using the equals method. I first explain how the equal operator works on objects, and then I'll demonstrate how to use and implement the equals method. For the example that I'll be using, I created a class named person. This class has a single member variable named name. It has getter and setter methods to access that member variable, and it has a parameterized constructor that expects a single argument and assigns that argument to the variable name. Now first I create multiple instances of that class. I declare a variable named John and I assign a new object to it with the name John. Then I declare a variable John2 and I assign John to John2. Then I declare a variable John3 and I initialize it to a new object that is also named John. And finally, I create a variable Mary and assign a new object to it named Mary. So I have 4 variables, John, John2, John3, and Mary, and I have 3 objects. Let's take a look how this looks in memory. I have John, and John references an object, a person object, that holds the member variable with John as the value for the name. Then it has John2. Now John2 references the same object. So there's a single object and there are 2 references to it. So whichever variable I use to access that object, they both work on the same object. Then I have a variable John3. This references another object, so that is not the same, but it is logically identical. The variables hold the same value as the other object that I have. And then I have a variable Mary that also references a new object, and this variable holds a different value. This one is Mary. So these 2 here are logically identical. This one is different. Now next, I want to use the equal operator to compare John to the 3 other variables. So here I use system.out.println. I want to compare John to itself, and I want to output the result of that comparison. So we'll do John equal John. Now running this will output true because it's identical, so it's probably what we expect, but the equal operator compares references. So we can note here, equal operator compares references. What that means is that these both reference the same object. And you can also think of in terms of pointers, they both point to the same memory location. So if you compare the same memory location, it will match up. It will be the same, and so it is true. Next, let's compare John to John2. John equal John2. I will run this again. Now this one also results in true because I assigned John to John2, and here it copied the memory location into John2. And so now both reference the same object, and so when the equal operator compares references, it will be true because it's the same object. Next, print line John equal John3, and I do the comparison to John3. I run this, and now this will output false because John references one object, John3 references another object, so the reference is different. And so when we compare it, it results in false. Next and last, I compare John to Mary. And running this is probably what you would expect. It will also output false because it's a different reference to a different object. Now let's do the same with the equals method. So here I have the 4 comparisons above. The only thing I changed is instead of using the equal operator, I call the equals method on the John object. So John.equals John, John.equals John2, and so on. Now let's run this again. And what we will see here, these are the 4 lines, is that we get true, true, false, false. Just what we got before, true, true, false, false. So there's not really a difference what we see at first. However, there is a big difference logically. The equals method should always be used to compare objects. And equals should compare values. So what we want to accomplish is that when calling the equals method on John and compare to John 3, it should result in true, because logically this represents the same object. Now what we have to do is we have to override the equals method. And here I go back to the person class. I use the @overwrite annotation to signal the compiler that I intend to override a method. I write the signature public boolean equals, and it has a single argument of type object. Note that this is of type object, not of type person. The reason for this is that we want to be able to compare an object to any other object in the application. And especially if we use polymorphism and we have a hierarchy of classes, for example, fruit as a superclass, and it has multiple subclasses, banana, apple, and so on. We want to be able to compare apples to oranges or an apple to another fruit. And the fruit could use polymorphism, so it might in fact be another apple. So we want to be flexible, and that's why the equals method expects an object of type object. Now the first comparison I do here is I compare the current object, this, to the object that's being passed in, using the equal operator, the reference comparison operator. So I compare if this points or references the same object as O. If it references the same object, I know it is identical, it is the same. Next, I check the class. Is the object that's being passed in actually the same class as person? And here there are multiple ways. It depends on what you want to use in your application. You could compare the exact class, or you could compare, is it an instance of person or an instance of any subclass. So I check for subclasses, and for that I check if O is an instance of person. Now I do if it's not an instance of person, then I return false. So the object must be an instance of person or an instance of any subclass of. The instance operator really checks if O can be assigned to a variable declared as person. Now, if it is indeed a person, I can use and cast it. So I use declare a new variable other. I cast O to person. And now I have 2 person objects, the current one, this, and other. And here I can do the comparison. I can check if this.name, now I use equals, string are objects, so I also want to use equals, other.name. And here I do, if it's not equal, I return false. If there are other comparisons I want to do, for example, if there would be age, I can check if this age is different than the other person's age, and I return false. And then after all the comparisons I done and nothing was different, I can return true. So you have a bunch of statements here that compare objects. Now in this case, I only have name, so I can shorten this. I don't need this statement. And there's one more catch here, because when we compare objects, we have to account for null values. So name could be null. So I would have to do a null check first before I can compare the string to the other string. Now there's one convenience method that I can use from the objects class, objects.equals, and then I can use this name and other.name. So I import objects. What this will do is it will call the equals method on the first variable name and compare it then to the other variable, the second parameter that is, or the second argument that's being passed in. But it will perform the null check for me. So there's less to write, it's more clear, it will be null safe. So it compares if name is null. If it is null, it compares that the other one is null as well. If it's not null, it makes sure that they are both the same. Now, since I only have a single variable to compare, I could even make this shorter. And I could do return the comparison for equality for name and other.name. And this is my equals method. Now that I overwrote the equals method, let's run this again. And here I will see that this just flipped to true. So now we have logical comparison. It compared person named John to person named John. And they are the same, so it will output true. So this is how you overwrite the equals method. Now, for classes that have a lot of member variables, you don't need to compare all the member variables. For example, if you have a book, you may use the title, the author, or if your class has an ISBN number, you might just compare the ISBN number in the equals method. So it really comes down to the member variables that make an object unique. Now, there are also things when you want to really focus on what makes an object unique without causing any issues. So if I have a person object that has a name and an address, I might go ahead and compare the name and the address. But that could result in errors in your program, because if that person moves, it has a different address, but it's still the same person. So you might not want to include the address in the equality comparison when you implement the equals method. So always pay attention to what makes an object unique and what can change without really changing the identity of that object. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.